Hey, welcome back to another episode of This Week in Christian History. And once again, we're doing a great deep dive to learn more about something unique and significant that happened this particular week in Christian history. And today, we're focused on June 29th, 1864. And on that day, the very first African was consecrated and made Bishop of the Church of England. And to talk to us a little bit more about that today is Dr. Melody Maxwell, who's an associate professor of history at Acadia Divinity College in Nova Scotia. So, welcome to the podcast today, Dr. Maxwell.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you.
Well, and also thank you for lending your talents to being a member of our academic advisory board. We're super extra happy about that to do.
Well, you're kind. I appreciate the work you do. Yeah.
Well, we think it's we're all headed somewhere with it, and hopefully it's somewhere good, right? So that would be a part of it too. So, um, uh, Samuel Ajayi, we don't know exactly how we would say it. Maybe that's the way we'd say it in Wiggins. Okay, is Ajayi Crowther, even though his name is spelled Crowther. It seems like that's how some folks would say his name, but he was the guy, right? He was the guy who actually was appointed. So. But before we appointed, was consecrated and was made bishop. So, but before we kind of get around to really understanding more about him, kind of what's some of the background of things that were going on in the world, within the church, and other things that were happening at that time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll just mention a bit. His Nigerian, his Yoruba name was Ajayi, and then Samuel was his Western, or some might call it Christian name, and he was this extraordinary leader. But I would say that what his service is doing is foreshadowing the African dominance of Christianity that happened in the years to come. So Andrew Walls, who's a really well-known mission historian, called him probably the most widely known African Christian of the 19th century,
That's pretty big.
which is significant. But I do want to back up, like you asked me to, and go even all the way back to the early church, right? So you're covering all of Christian history in your
Yes,
podcast,
right.
which is admirable. That's a big task. In my classes, I spend one semester and we do 2,000 years of Christian history, and it flies by in 12 weeks. And so I have some empathy for what you're doing here. So when you think about it, the church arose, it came out of the Mediterranean world, right?
Mhm.
So you might see paintings or things that, you think of white Europeans for the first Christians, but they really weren't. They were brown-skinned folks from the Middle East. And so from the Middle East, Christianity really spreads then to other regions of the world. So, we don't think about it, but from the early days, there were Christians in countries like India, the
Mhm.
Thomas Christians, Ethiopia, the church there, very ancient, and China. We have evidence of that as well. Only later does Christianity spread to Europe. So it starts out in the Mediterranean world, then spreads to Europe. In the Middle Ages, becomes dominant in Europe, and so that's sort of the context some of us know. And by the 19th century, I would say, this time we're talking about today, Christianity was really centered around the European world. But I just want us to recognize this wasn't always the case, and it
Mhm.
will not always be the case. And so Crowder is sort of leading us in to this new era. So, but let me make sure I situate myself back in the 19th century.
Sure.
You have European colonization, trade, you have colonies on different continents. And so, there's some negative things about colonization. They're exploiting natural resources and the labor of indigenous peoples. Uh, I'm not here to debate the good and bad of that movement, but I will say that missionaries came. Sometimes colonizers sort of cleared the way for the missionaries to come, but they weren't the same. They weren't hand in hand. Sometimes they conflicted with each other. They didn't
Mhm.
have the same motives, but there's a complexity in the history there, but
Mhm.
beyond what
Mhm.
probably we can get into here. But we have Catholic mission work that happens first, and we get Protestant mission work. And so we're moving into the era of modern missions, in the 19th century. So William Carey and his colleagues go to India, 1793, considered the father of modern missions, although we've found out that George Lyle went before that actually. But anyway, by the 19th century, we have these missionaries from Europe and North America who are traveling around the world seeking to evangelize people. And in many cases, and it's unfortunate to think of this today, but they also said they wanted to civilize the people.
Hmm.
So we have hindsight and we can see that imposing any particular culture along with the gospel, particularly Western culture, is not a wise move, but it was common at the time. And so these missionaries are going and evangelizing, also bringing cultural change, some for good, some for bad. Um, but Africa starts to become a center of Christian mission work. It was, you might have heard it called the white man's graveyard at the
Mm,
time because a lot of missionaries, once they got there, they would die from tropical diseases. And really sadly, we also have the transatlantic slave trade going on at this time, as traders they're kidnapping and transporting millions of Africans across the ocean to enslave them, I guess.
Well, I mean, part of that too, right, was by this time, where the Europeans were doing their colonization, they'd already done all the North and South America that they were, going to get done, right? And so the British obviously were taking the super lead over into the southeast, and maybe but by this time, the that we're talking about here for the time period of this missionary work, Africa was kind of the big spot to go to, right? I mean, it was maybe other countries, right, started to get into the game, if you will, that had not been into it. Belgium and some others like that, the Germans and others that said, hey, we kind of missed out on this first wave. And so we want to get in on this wave, maybe. France is trying to reinvent themselves and come back into the world. They don't seem to be as focused on doing mission work as maybe as what would have happened throughout Great Britain. And I may not have that correct, but this is kind of where the if you're going to hunt where the ducks are, as they say, if you're going to go to some spot where where in their mind needed to be mission work that actually were being done, Africa was kind of a big spot. Is that probably
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And they, as it makes sense, they started on in the coastal areas because those were easier to access, and then went in some of the rivers, and then finally to the inland areas.
Mm-hmm. Wow. All right. So how does this all kind of fit into Bishop Crowder's story? How does that, knowing that that's kind of the background?
Yeah, it's a great question. So he he really lives across the 19th century. He was born in 1808 in what today is Nigeria, in the Yoruba land where the Yoruba people still are today. Um, and so he is in this context of mission work and also, unfortunately, slavery, the slave trade, because when he's about 13 years old, African slave hunters came and captured him and his family.
Mm,
I can't imagine how terrible and traumatic that must have been. He never saw his father again, actually.
wow.
Um, they were separated, and it was years before he saw his mother and sister again, like many years. So he was taken to the coast to a Portuguese slave ship to be sold into slavery. I mean, the terrible transatlantic slave trade that we hear about. But so what actually happened is this Portuguese ship was sailing, and then a British ship captured them and freed the slaves because by this time slavery was outlawed. Yeah, I think I have to do the math, but the
That
British were
sounds right.
capturing them and took them. They didn't send them back home though. They took them to Sierra Leone, which they'd sort of made as a colony for freed Africans. And so can you imagine being like 13 years old, having this terrible event happen to you, and then you're dropped in this strange land with
Mm,
a strange language without your family? And so I have a lot of respect for how he managed to persist and even achieve and thrive in these really difficult circumstances. So one thing he learns to speak English, and he gets involved in studies as a student, and he shows that he's a really excellent student. He gets involved with the Church of England, And as I mentioned, he took on the name Samuel after he was baptized. He learned a trade as a carpenter and also as a teacher and a missionary. So this is a very talented, multi-talented, and busy guy. He grows up, he marries a woman named Susan Asano Thompson, and they have 6 children. So he has gone from a difficult life and made it into a good life. There are many others in Sierra Leone who have similar situations as far as their backgrounds, where they had come from. But he is involved with the Church of England and different Anglican Church Missionary Society missionaries. And so they recognize his abilities and they ask him to go with them in 1841 down the Niger River in an expedition. Um, is that Niger River? Should that be Niger?
No, I think it's Niger. No.
Okay. Well, take that part out, please.
Okay.
Um, he goes down the river with more than 100 European missionaries, and he really shows his strength, his character. Then, um, one source says that his work was the most thorough of anybody who was in the expedition, and he was a really significant contributor to it. And something else that happens during this trip is that most of the Europeans fall ill with malaria, other diseases, because they're not acclimated to the tropical climate and
Mm-hmm.
conditions. And so he survives and even thrives during this voyage. And they say, like, we like what you do. Could you keep doing it more? He goes on 2 more major expeditions down the river in the course of his life and has really proved himself to these Europeans. He, in 1843, so a couple years later, he travels to England, which is a really significant step, right? That's pretty far away. You
Sure.
can't just hop on a plane like we can these days. And so he became familiar with the British world as well as his Yoruba and Nigerian context and those roots. So he was a good bridge across the cultures. It became that. And so he was actually ordained as an Anglican priest in that time at 1843. um, they had to, like, the closest bishop was the one who would ordain you, and the one in London was the closest to West Africa, if you can imagine. So really, the church was centered in England, Europe, and so there was not anything in his region. So he's really helping open up things.
Right. We shouldn't think about this as the greater, bigger church, right? That would have had places all over that would have been Catholic and others. But for the Church of England, right, there's the closest one was there in London,
Right.
right? I mean,
England, yeah, that's
as
right.
compared to what we were looking at for West Africa, right? So, hey, we're enjoying our conversation very much here with Dr. Melody Maxwell, who's talking about the very first African to be ordained bishop in the Church of England. And we are talking about Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther, or something close enough to that in the way that my South Mississippi language might be able to pronounce his name. So he's there in England, and he's about to be ordained bishop,
Ordained.
but it doesn't really sound like he necessarily was a guy who started out to try to be a clergyman, right? Or somebody that really he was doing his work, whatever his work was, things as being carpentry and other, raising kids and having a family, and goes on these missionary expeditions, and he catches the attention, right, of the missionary society folks, and going, hey, you really got something going on here, man. We really, we really like what it is that you've been doing. We'd love for you to do more of it.
Yeah, and in the different sources that you read about him, they all say that he was a pretty humble guy,
Mm,
and so some of what was going on here is the different ideology. The Church Missionary Society, Henry Venn is the leader of it, and he had this idea of 3 self that's even sometimes still talked about today, wanting the churches in Africa and around the world to become self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating, and not dependent
mm,
on those from the West. And so he sees, look, we need an African leader here
mm,
to help these 3 selves emerge. And so uh, he does. They give Crowder leadership positions. So that was when he became a priest, and then he goes back to Africa, and he works with the CMS, this mission organization, Anglican missions, with their Yoruba mission. Although Europeans were still in charge of it, he's working with it.
Hmm.
And he does some really great work in Bible translation, for example. He translates the Bible into Yoruba. This was the first Bible translation in an African language by an African.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I think that's quite significant. We shouldn't
Absolutely.
overlook that. And he preaches in Yoruba as well, under a tree with like 100 to 200 people every morning. I can just picture that, can't you?
Wow.
Yeah, and he's really gifted in languages, so he starts working among other language groups as well. And so he's leading sort of this mission to other language groups, and everybody working with him is African, which is a remarkable thing at the
Hmm.
time. He also engages with Islam. One scholar said that he did it with patience and readiness to listen. So he was really gifted in a lot of ways. He even met the Queen another time that he went to London,
Wow.
had an audience with her. So, I mean, you can tell from the hindsight, of today but the people at the time clearly recognized that he was this remarkable leader.
He wasn't just some dude that they found that happened to
Yeah,
be
he was
doing good
handpicked. Yeah,
work, right? I mean, like this guy's got the juice, right? I mean, this
that's
guy really
right.
knows what he's doing here, and he gets it, and he understands the importance. Probably, I'm putting words in other people's mouths, but I'm just saying
Sure,
that he gets the importance of where he is at this time within what he's doing for the church, and how we can really, bridge this gap and really do this whole, self three, mindset here, right? I mean, to really be able to move it. Well, so what else? What happens to him after that? I mean, he's had this high point. He's met the queen. He's done this. He's the bishop now, and he's
well,
there
that
now.
was when he had become priest. But let me tell
Oh,
you
been priest.
about
He
when.
hadn't been bishop yet.
No,
Okay.
so he
Okay.
goes back. I mean, there's a different hierarchy and polity in the Church of England, right? So in 1864 is that June 29th date that we're really talking about here. So
Gotcha.
and he says, no, I don't want this. I shouldn't do this. And then the three self guy says, no, you're the right person for this job. You're African to lead other Africans. And so on that day, they were in Canterbury Cathedral, was filled to overflowing before 8 a.m.
Wow.
To see this momentous occasion. And so he was consecrated bishop over this huge area of Africa. It was kind of vague, actually. Bishop of the countries of Western Africa beyond the Queen's dominions. Not a precise line, but it was true. Like by the way they said that, it meant that he wouldn't take over the area which the white missionaries were already working.
Ah.
Yeah, so there's some interesting dynamics
Mm,
going
mm,
on there. Not all of these white missionaries thought or supported an African being in leadership. And, sadly, some even refused to work under him because he was African. So, some quite troubling prejudice and believing that white men were superior to
mhm.
black. And so he faced some challenges from that in his day. And I think we can see some forms of this persisting in some parts of the church even till today.
Sure. Unfortunately, yes, we do. So did things get better? I mean, hey, you're now the bishop, and hooray! And you've met the queen, and now you've met the queen, and right, and you've had this great day at Canterbury, at this iconic place, right? I mean, that is a part of that is the church, and so you're back there doing your thing. I mean, did everything end up well for him after that?
Yeah, it was a momentous occasion, and we're still talking about him today. But in many ways, things were difficult for him after this time. In some ways, yes, that things went well, but because he did significant work, he was this
Hmm.
super smart, a wonderful guy, and the Anglican Church started to grow in areas where he was leading. And he knew how to handle cultural issues. He was from the West African context. So things like polygamy and what do we do with this? He was on top of it. And also there was a time when the Western missionaries were kicked out, but he was allowed to stay there because he was African. But his later years were kind of difficult because again, he's getting resistance from these Western missionaries. Some wanted to pull him out of the leadership, and in fact, they dismissed most of his indigenous, his African staff.
Hmm.
And there was all sorts of conversations back and forth. The missionaries accused the staff of misconduct, but they didn't even let Crowther read the report. So, again, some not so good dynamics going on there.
Hmm.
One scholar says that Crowther was the victim of the twin thrusts of colonialism and Western missionary zeal, both underpinned by racism. And so he died, I would almost say a broken man at age 89 after some really negative experiences. He still had his faith, but things in the church were not going very well.
Wow. Well, even considering all of that, kind of having an ending like that, right? I mean, would you say that he still, though, is somebody who is significant, particularly when we're talking about things of history, and even more importantly about church history?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if we see him consecrated as the first African bishop, this is really significant. And in fact, even at his own in his own time, other people realize this as well. So this news starts spreading in newspapers around the world. It didn't spread as quickly, like a click of the mouse today could spread it, but they did hear about it. And so Christians, indigenous Christians in other countries started asking for their own bishops,
Huh?
what they called native bishops at the time. Like, we don't need missionaries to do this. Our own people can do it. So this idea of the three self church actually started to be realized in some way. But the sad part is that there wasn't another African Anglican bishop until the 1950s. So like 60 years later. So he's really ahead of his time
Mhm. Yeah.
in leadership. And I would say he really foreshadows the growing role of the church in Africa and the global south, which really takes off in the 20th century. That's been one of the defining characteristics, I would say, of the church, of Christianity in the past 100 years or so. So, around 100 years ago, early 1900s, there were four times as many Christians in what we would call the global north as in the global south. And today, there are more Christians in the global south than the
Mm.
global north, like 60% to 40%. And so the numbers just keep growing, growing, growing in the global south, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and declining in the global north. And this growth is largely from indigenous and independent churches, those who have their own African leaders, that those folks like Crowther empowered other Africans to take the lead in their own churches and denominations. And it does foreshadow also in the 20th century, there's different pushback against colonial and missions leadership by those from the global south. And so I would say that he's really ahead of his time, but he's setting this trajectory of African leadership that continues in the global church until today.
Mm.
And so this is a guy I think can continue to inspire us, can continue to inspire folks in Africa and around the world to take the lead in ministry, even if others think that they know better. But they recognize that the center of gravity in the church has really shifted to the global south. His story demonstrates that, and I hope that we can continue to learn from his story as we go forward today.
Absolutely. Well, and maybe part of what it is, and I'm just pontificating here, right? But
Yeah,
maybe part of it was not just because he was the first and the pioneer that kind of put the stake in the ground, if you will, and said, yeah, but it helped other people understand within the church, hey, this is a model we can follow here. It doesn't all need to be, Judson and Taylor and, all the rest of them, and, getting on a boat and going over, although that's great and good and fine
right.
if we're not letting it grow from within and be able to be its own church and be able to communicate, you bunch of white dudes can't come in here and start talking to these folks about polygamy and why it's right and wrong when there's been a whole history of that the people who are from there who are Christians and are going to do a far more important and impactful job than you're going to be able to pull off. And
Absolutely.
and so Crowder is a it's kind of a North Star on that, right? And to be able to say, here's an example of why it is. Not just because it was significant, although it certainly was about being the first African to be a bishop. It's really kind of more of the of the legacy of what he helped to help others to be able to see, here's the model that
Yeah,
could work right.
absolutely.
Is that probably right? That was a huge statement instead of a question, but I mean, it's
And no, he certainly is an example of indigenous leadership without, who can contextualize and understand the context well and can be an example for others as they're looking to for the churches to mature and grow uh, of their own accord.
yeah. How very, very cool. Well, I tell you what, thank you. Thanks for hanging out with us today. We have enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Melody Maxwell, who is coming to us from Nova Scotia at Acadia Divinity College, and we're talking about this great moment in history. So, Dr. Maxwell, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Absolutely.